A very good morning to all and a warm welcome from the Antioquia University, Universidad de Antioquia, from the School of Public Health. We have organized this webinar, which is part of our academic seminar series. So this is the 7th Global Health Systems Symposium, and it will take place, or it started in October, and we've been covering several topics. So we will also hope to see on the 8th of June at 6:30 p.m. We'll have a webinar organized by the Pontifical Xaverian University here in Colombia. So we will have participation from their campuses in Cali and Bogotá, as well as the Rosario University with their various campuses around the country. So this is a cordial welcome for you to join us for that symposium. It will be a hybrid format, and of course, you are welcome to join us in Bogotá. And I will now hand over to Professor Daniel Patiño from Antioquia University, from the Faculty of Medicine, as our moderator today. So with no further ado, let me hand over to Daniel so we can get started. Thank you very much, Professor Jairo. A very good morning to you all. Welcome to those of you joining us today. So in the name of the organizers of this 7th Global Symposium, and organized by Cartagena, Rosario, Xaverian University, and the Santo Ignacio Hospital, as well as the School of Public Health here at Antioquia University, I would like to welcome you now to this webinar called Strengthening the Use of Evidence Learnings from the Pandemic. Why did we decide to hold this webinar? Basically, what we want to do is to share what we have learned during this pandemic when it comes to closing the existing gap between scientific evidence and the formulation of public policy. The pandemic has shown us the need to improve our support systems when it comes to the use of evidence for citizens, scientists, and legislators. So we believe it is time to systematize the aspects of use of evidence that have worked. There are many deficiencies that exist, which means that there are many opportunities and challenges that exist. We have social challenges. We also need to look at structures and processes to ensure we can continue to use evidence. This is very closely related to this year's Global Symposium, which is about the performance of health systems in the heart of political agendas, looking at global challenges, both present and future. I would now like to introduce our panelists before I explain the format of today's event. We are joined by 4 people. The first of these is Professor John Lavis. He is a professor in supporting the formulation of public policy through the use of scientific evidence to face social challenges. He is co-director and author of the Global Commission for the Use of Evidence, or the Evidence Commission, and he will be sharing a presentation with us today. He's also co-director of Coveted, and he also works at the McMaster Health Forum, which is the WHO agency for informed public policy. And he works at the University of Johannesburg and has a doctorate in medicine, a master's in sciences from LSE, and has also studied at Harvard University. We are also joined today by Laura Boira. She is the executive director of the Veredas Institute, which is a Brazilian NGO, which looks at knowledge production for evidence-based policy. She's also co-director of the Latin American Hub for Informed Policies, or Evidence-Informed Policies. We are joined by Lucy Kuhn, who is an economist, a health economist, with a master's in political relations and has studied in London. She has a master's in public policy from University of Chile and a diploma in public policy from Chicago University. She's currently coordinator of the evidence-supported policy area in the Ministry of Health in Chile. And she's also worked in other public institutions in Chile and in the UK. We are finally joined by Verónica Osorio, who's also an economist with a specialization in public policy and social challenge, with regional experience in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa. She has worked as a health economist in various international organizations and also works on research projects for evidence-based policy in Bolivia. She's currently a doctoral candidate at UCL in the UK, where she analyzes knowledge translation platforms in Latin America and works with the development of the Latin American Hub for evidence-based policy. She participated and continues to participate in Emerging Voices for Global Health. This webinar is being recorded. The recording will be available after the session. It's also being live streamed on our Facebook profile with the participating universities mentioned previously. We also have simultaneous interpretation today, so there is an icon down the bottom of your Zoom screen. You'll see that there is an icon of a globe for interpretation. So please select the channel of your preference. Please make sure that you select the channel that corresponds to the language you want to hear in and speak in. So we have an initial presentation today of 30 minutes in which John will present his report to us and talk about the findings and recommendations of the Global Commission on Evidence to Address Societal Challenges. Then we will hear from Laura, Lucy, and Veronica. In that order, they will each have 15 minutes to tell us about learnings and challenges that they have found and faced during the pandemic, looking at the use of scientific evidence in their experience. And more than anything else, we just want to ensure that the audience joining us today participates. If you have any questions, please make sure to share your questions in the Q&A module here in Zoom. We will be collecting those questions so we can have a Q&A space after our panelists have finished presenting. So with no further ado, let me please hand over to John Lavis so he can share his 30-minute presentation with us.
Great, thanks very much, Danielle. Can you just confirm that you can see my screen in full slide mode? Yes, great, thank you, Jairo. So thanks very much for having me, and apologies, although my Spanish is improving slowly, it's still not good enough to present, so I'll be presenting in English. And I'm very, very grateful to our hosts at the University of Antioquia, Danielle and his team, who have been leading the translation of the Evidence Commission report into Spanish, and we're thrilled that it's available in that language. What I'm going to do is give you a bit of context for how the Evidence Commission report came to be. It builds on the experiences of an initiative called Coveted, which I'll describe. I'll then talk about some of the key concepts and some of the key recommendations in the report. And I'll just briefly at the end summarize some of the Evidence Commission Secretariat's current implementation priorities, which we group into 3 areas. Strengthening domestic evidence infrastructures. So whether you're in Brazil or Colombia or Canada, putting in place the infrastructure to support evidence use, enhancing and leveraging the global evidence architecture, and then finally, putting evidence at the center of everyday life. So starting with the context for the Evidence Commission, the impetus for it came from what at the time that we set it up was more than 12 months, but now is more than 25 months of supporting decision-making about COVID-19 and all aspects of COVID-19, public health measures, clinical management, health system arrangements, and economic and social responses. We had the good fortune to bring together 55 partners from around the globe, world-leading evidence synthesis, technology assessment, and guideline groups many of which act themselves as an umbrella for many other evidence partners. We also, a few months after Coveted Global started, began a Coveted in Canada initiative to support decision-making in my own country. These are some of the global partners in Coveted, many of which anchor the evidence infrastructure in their country. And part of the reason why we were able to learn so much so fast was because of the unique opportunity of listening to all of these groups, both what was going well and where the gaps were from their perspective. Two examples of Coveded's achievements. One is a pipeline of ultra-rapid and living evidence syntheses. The ultra-rapid syntheses are very contextualized to a given context, often produced in very short timelines, as short as 4 hours, typically not longer than 3 to 5 days. But we also maintain living evidence syntheses that are updated regularly over long periods of time. And one of our Coveted partners at the University of Antioquia, led by Iban Flores, maintains one of these living evidence syntheses focused on vaccine effectiveness against variants in children and adolescents. And that living evidence synthesis is updated every 2 weeks. So as new studies come out, they're slotted in with the existing evidence. Second achievement is the Coveted Inventory of Evidence Synthesis, which was designed to improve the signal to noise ratio. So as of a few weeks ago, we had processed more than 13,000 evidence syntheses, and out of all of those, identified just over 600 that we considered to be the best evidence syntheses for any given decision. And best was defined by quality of the synthesis, recency of the search for evidence, and the availability of a great evidence profile. We would have had to have looked at many, many more syntheses, perhaps double this number, had we not had a number of high quality living evidence syntheses. So we can now ignore all the syntheses of single drug treatments, for example, because there are 4 high quality living evidence syntheses looking at all drug treatments. So the good news during COVID-19, we had never before seen such demand for evidence from political leaders in most, but not all countries, nor such innovation in evidence products and processes. But some of the bad news is that there was, as I indicated before, a very low signal to noise ratio, uneven coverage of topics, and you'll see here very few for economic and social responses, very, very many on clinical management. Low quality, so unfortunately 1 in every 4 reviews was low quality, 1 in 2 reviews was of medium quality, and outdatedness. So many of the rapid reviews done on a one-off basis rapidly superseded as new evidence came available. Globally, had we invested early in the pandemic in an evolving suite of high-quality living evidence syntheses, we would have saved ourselves from tremendous amounts of research waste globally. And we need to do better with this in the future. Secondly, we can't continue to respond to policymakers' questions with preprints, squeaky wheel experts, and old school expert panels. We really need to be looking for best evidence. So rather than a preprint, look for the living evidence synthesis where that preprint has been assessed for quality and put alongside all the others. On the right-hand side, we also think we need to try to avoid responding with only select forms of evidence. The 3 most common that we saw during COVID-19 were data analytics, modeling, and one-off evaluation studies, and try for the right mix of forms of evidence. So we also need behavioral and implementation research, qualitative research, and well-conducted evidence syntheses and guidelines. The final thing where we need to do better, or final area where we need to do better, is we can't continue to ignore the context for policymakers' use of evidence. We need to understand in central agencies, in the Science and Technology Ministry, in line ministries like the Ministry of Health, what are the existing types of decisions made, what structures provide a way in for evidence, and what processes may provide a way in for evidence. And sometimes these groups may have in-house units they can rely on, other times formal partnerships with groups like Danielle's, and they may also rely on UN system entities like a WHO country office. And we need to know that if we're going to support them in using evidence. So the Evidence Commission report has two main goals. First, to provide the context, concepts, and vocabulary that underpin work in this area. And secondly, to provide recommendations about how we can and must improve the use of evidence, both with global crises like the one we've been living through for the last 2 years with COVID-19, but also in routine times. The report is available in 7 languages, including, thanks to Danielle and his team, in Spanish, and is available for free on the Evidence Commission website. We'll also soon be making every individual chapter, all of the infographics, separately available in Spanish on the Evidence Commission website. You can also read some of the specific key messages coming out of the report in a number of other publications. So there was an editorial in Nature speaking about the key insights from the Evidence Commission report, a guest essay in the New York Times specifically addressing health misinformation, and you'll see some other examples here if you want to dive into particular topics. So I'll go through some of the key concepts for the Evidence Commission report and paying particular attention to the concepts that often are the biggest departure from how many people may currently be thinking about how we use evidence to address societal challenges. So one of the key concepts in the Evidence Commission report is the idea that there are 8 forms in which evidence is typically encountered by decision-making. And if you start in the lower left, you'll see data analytics, and then going around, the final one is guidelines. So these are forms in which evidence is typically encountered. One of the things that we need to be able to do is to match the form of evidence to the right step in the decision-making process. So data analytics, particularly helpful at the front end with step 1, understanding a problem and its causes, and helpful at the back end, step 4, monitoring implementation and evaluating impacts. But behavioral and implementation research, 3 rows down in the table, is particularly helpful at step 3, identifying implementation considerations. We also need to be able to go in the opposite direction, to match the step or the specific policy question to the right form of evidence. So if you're looking to understand how different people describe or experience a problem and its causes, you would want to look for qualitative studies. So very important to be able to go back and forth between the form of evidence and the type of question that policymakers are or should be asking. Second key concept is that we need to rely on the combined power of local evidence. So what has been learned in my country, whether that be Brazil, Colombia, Chile, Canada, and the best global evidence. So what has been learned from around the world, including how it varies by groups and contexts. So 5 of the forms of evidence that I mentioned before are typically forms of local evidence: data analytics, modeling, evaluation, behavioral and implementation research, and qualitative insights. And then you have evidence syntheses. Increasingly, we're seeing living evidence syntheses that bring you the best global evidence. These living evidence syntheses add new evidence as it's made available, based on its quality. So we have a continually evolving picture of what the entire evidence base tells us, not just what the newest study says. Good ones also describe how much certainty we can have about particular findings, and they don't accept the journal's peer review as synonymous with quality. They independently assess its quality. At the bottom of this table, you'll see we often also have local recommendations or evidence support, which is also typically informed by both local and global evidence. So this can include technology assessments and guidelines. The third set of key concepts has to do with using the right strategies to support the use of the best evidence. And you'll see 5 groupings or 5 types of strategies on the left-hand side, with some examples on the right-hand side of a particular strategy. We're very focused right now with some of our work on encouraging government science advisors to speak in a way that makes it possible to judge their accuracy. During COVID-19, we had many, many experts, often in the media, also speaking to policymakers, and it was very rare that they would explain how they identified, assessed, and interpreted the evidence. And it became very hard to know how much was their personal opinion versus how much was based on evidence. During COVID-19, we've seen a lot of what people call the co-production of evidence, having policymakers and citizen partners work alongside researchers to generate new local evidence, to synthesize the best evidence globally, and to combine the two of them into local decision support, like in a guideline. One of the areas that has really exploded during the last 2 years has been the provision of timely, demand-driven, contextualized evidence products that say, if we're in Canada dealing with this particular issue, what does the evidence tell us about a problem and its causes, the likely benefits and harms of an option to address the problem, and how we should go about implementation? Some of the other strategies, one-stop evidence shops, like the Coveted inventory that I mentioned, and another strategy, convening citizen panels and stakeholder dialogues, so the evidence can be put alongside the citizen values, all of the other political factors that will influence decision-making. The fourth and final concept is that we need an evidence support system and an evidence implementation system alongside our national research systems and our national innovation system. We've often tried to make our research system do double duty, to both function as a place where new knowledge can be created, but also hope that researchers will take that research and bring it to the attention of decision makers. What I think many of us are now starting to realize is we need a separate system, which the Evidence Commission report calls an evidence support system, grounded in an understanding of the local context, demand-driven, and focused on contextualizing the evidence for a given decision in an equity-sensitive way. And that means we need a variety of types of infrastructure in place, including processes to find and package evidence that meets the needs of decision makers within set time constraints. So on to the Evidence Commission report recommendations, 24 in total. 8 of them, which are bolded here in this slide, we consider to be the most important recommendations. But in the few months since the report was first published in English, we've come to realize that the big opportunities for making a difference in 2022, we think, fall primarily into 3 groupings. Improving domestic evidence infrastructures, and those are the recommendations highlighted in green, so especially building up the evidence support system. Second, enhancing and leveraging the global evidence architecture. That's the one that is in the more pink color, largely on the evidence producer side. And then the one that we know is a very big undertaking, but we need to start taking the steps now. We need to build evidence into everyday life. So it becomes the new normal for citizens and becomes something that is second nature. And that's the recommendation highlighted in blue. So I'll just speak briefly in wrapping up about our current implementation priorities with the Evidence Commission Secretariat. So our first priority, as I mentioned, strengthening domestic evidence infrastructures through rapid learning and improvement. So we're currently working with 20 jurisdictions, typically countries, but in the case of Canada, we're looking at both the national level and at 2 of our provinces. So those are 3 separate jurisdictions within Canada. And within a given jurisdiction, we're looking at central agencies like the Cabinet Office, like the Ministry of Finance, parts of government that have a whole of government perspective. And then we're also looking at 3 departments or topics. So it may be a department like the Ministry of Health, or it may be a topic net zero emissions that cuts across departments. And we're looking specifically at what in-house units are available to support evidence use, what supports are available through formal partnerships, like the one that a government may have with Danielle's unit at the University of Antioquia, and what supports are available through UN system entities like the World Health Organization Country Office. And we're trying to understand what's the context for decision-making, what structures and processes provide a way in for evidence, what is the context for external partners and UN system entities contributing to the evidence infrastructure, and what approaches or strategies are being used to support evidence use. And it's not meant to be a big academic exercise. It's meant to be a very pragmatic, rapid assessment with the goal of coming up with 2 types of priorities. One is systematizing what's going well. So coming up with that list of things that are going well that need to be systematized or scaled up. And the second is a list of gaps to fill in this current year before COVID-19 evidence investments come to an end. So if you're in a country and you're interested in improving your domestic evidence infrastructure, please think about conducting one of these assessments, and we'd be happy to share the procedures with you. When we talk to our policymaker partners about what we're learning, we sometimes find that a sporting metaphor helps us. So here you'll see a podium, some with one person with a gold, one a silver, one a bronze. And what we'd like countries to be thinking about is, where do they currently, for any given part of the evidence support system, where do they currently rate? Are they on the podium? Or might there be examples from their own country or another country that might be a gold medal that could be adapted and used in their country? On this slide, I have the example of Canada, where we're not on the podium with most of our COVID-19 expert panels. So they do not have the right mix of people around the table, people with issue-specific knowledge, evidence appraisal expertise, and lived experience. They're not supported to follow a rigorous process to develop their recommendations, and they're not typically living. So they don't continue to meet and adjust their recommendations as the evidence and situation evolve. We have one example of an expert panel in Canada that we thought deserved a medal of some type, our National Advisory Committee on Immunization, but we think a gold performance came from Australia's Living COVID guidelines, and we would love to see something like that adapted for the Canadian context. So this just gives you an example of how we're starting to talk about how countries can look at what they're currently doing, identify gaps, and where they have gaps, think about looking at other countries and say, could something like that work for us if we adapt it to our context? The second implementation priority is enhancing and leveraging the global evidence architecture. WHO, the World Health Organization, and UNICEF, with its Innocenti Research Center, are in fact positive outliers in the UN system. They have, over a number of years, been slowly building their capacity to use evidence in their normative guidance, in the technical assistance they provide, and they also invest in evidence-related global public goods like living evidence syntheses. But the majority of the UN system does not do that. And the UN's quintet of change only speaks to some forms of evidence. And the UN Secretary General is about to rename a reinvigorated scientific advisory board. And we hope that it will provide an opportunity to have much higher quality expert panel standards than has been the case in the past. There's also other groups that have a key role to play, the World Bank, with funding evidence-related global public goods like living evidence syntheses, funders who can support domestic evidence infrastructures, and so on. The final implementation priority is about putting evidence at the center of everyday life. So we spend a lot of time and energy in summarizing the evidence, especially for high-level decision makers. But we think that the future is one where evidence just becomes embedded in everyday life. You go to pick up a prescription drug and there is a drug fact box that explains in plain language what you need to know. You want to purchase a new product or service, so you go to a website that brings the best evidence to bear on helping you select among them. You want to volunteer your time or donate your money to a particular charity, so you go to a website that helps you pick the charity that will yield the biggest impact on citizens. So we think that there's tremendous opportunity to build evidence into the background of so many of the supports that we turn to when we try to make best or decisions based on best evidence. So some conclusions, my final slide. Many countries, we think, advanced more in their domestic or their national evidence support systems in the last 2 years than they'd advanced in the previous 23 or 25. We feel that we're facing a once-in-a-generation opportunity to work with political leaders to build on the right lessons learned from their own and others' countries. We think it would be really helpful for every country to take a look at its own approaches to using evidence, to identify what's working well, celebrate it, scale it up, and to identify what gaps exist, and especially with the domestic evidence support system. And we think that a rapid learning and improvement approach would mean people can try out new things and adjust them as they go and progressively do better. So that's a quick run through of the Evidence Commission report, a sense of what we're currently focused on. And again, we're very, very grateful to Daniel and his colleagues for making all of this available in Spanish. So I'll wrap up there, Danielle, I think 5 minutes earlier because we got going a bit late, and turn it back to you.
Gracias, John.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you for your presentation. Thank you for providing the recommendations and the implementation priorities as well, and the conclusions of this report from the Global Commission on Evidence. And for sure, there are many questions from our audience. And so I'd like to also motivate the attendees that are joining us to share your questions through the Q&A module on Zoom, so that you can share the questions that you may have on what John shared and what our next speakers will also share. So we have an interactive end of the session where we will have some time for Q&A. So now I'd like to give the floor to Laura. Laura will present the perspective on the use of evidence, the evidence used during the pandemic in Brazil specifically, and some of the challenges that they faced. She represents an NGO located in Brazil. Laura, please take the floor. Thank you very much, Daniel. And thank you as well to all the team for your invitation and for this very enriching session. It's always very positive to listen to experiences from North America and Latin America. I apologize because my Spanish is not yet as good as I'd like for me to be able to present, but you will see the slides in English and I will speak a mixture between Portuguese and Spanish, and I hope that we can understand. Please let me know if you can see my slides now. All right. If I change slides, are you able to see them? Can you see the changing slide? I don't see a change of slide. Can you please go to presentation mode, Laura? Now does it change? Yes, now we see it. Great, thank you. There is a glitch with Zoom. I cannot enable presentation mode. All right, so I will speak from my perspective as the director of this NGO. This is a civil society organization, and it's called Instituto Veredas. We created this NGO in the year 2016. And we created it as a joint experience of people who had worked with the federal government of Brazil, and we worked in the health sector and public health. And basically, we were taken by surprise by how things were made in a very informal way. And these were decision-making processes that certainly affect millions of lives in Brazil. So for us, it was very important that knowledge from the universities would really reach governments. And we thought that the best way to do this was to create an NGO and create a triangle of knowledge between the universities, the government, and the civil society. Since the beginning, our organization assumed the commitment not only working with the public health sector, which was a sector in which this debate was a bit more advanced, but as well with human rights sector, criminal justice, and labor market inclusion problems or fields. So since the year 2016, we started working with these other sectors and get to know their challenges and the potential tools we could all use and share. Something to point out from our experience is that when the pandemic hit Brazil, well, for us, perhaps this is the most important task we carried out, which was all the network we created, both with the executive as well as the judicial branches of the Brazilian government. Brazil is a federal country. We have 27 states and over 25,000 cities. And they each have, and over 25 main cities, and they all have administrative autonomy. Therefore, to be able to create this network of partners was key in the work we've carried out. We've carried out 50 evidence syntheses as well as maps, and many tools have been shared together with the public health sector. However, we've adapted them to the other sectors, as most times they don't really have a lot of systemic studies. They have much more primary studies of different qualities and many qualitative studies. And therefore, all the advances in qualitative synthesis work really has been helpful in Brazil. So the pandemic reaches its peak, and I want to talk a bit about the evidence ecosystem in Brazil. So when we created our NGO in the year 2016, well, the evidence ecosystem was very much polarized in Brazil, meaning on the one hand, people who were more politically left-wing, well, they perceived evidence as something very structured, as something very difficult to understand. So we were a bit rejected with this debate, where they, for example, on the question, well, does evidence help the welfare and development of our country? And the people that were perhaps from other political perspectives preferred to select the evidence that most interested them, because these were evidence that confirmed what they were saying or arguing. Therefore, the political debate on the evidence ecosystem was not very, I would say, supported and popular in Brazil. However, as you well know, we had an important change from the year 2016 in our federal government. We had a president that suffered an impeachment, and then she remained in the presidency for some other years, and now we have our current president. And this basically changed. Even before the pandemic occurred, this changed the narratives about the use of the evidence ecosystem in the political realm. So for us, it was very interesting to accompany and see how we started having at the same time a lot of conversations about the value of evidence, and also conversations that advocated for science and the use of evidence, while other groups, they were basically against it. And this was very much polarized and strong since the year 2019, when we had this change of government. And what happened was basically that at a federal state level, in these 27 states of Brazil, well, the demand for evidence grew or increased a lot, and our capacity of supplying knowledge transfer products and evidence products was not quite as big, even with all the efforts of people such as, for example, the Professor Jorge Baqueta in Brazil. He basically carried out millions of trainings throughout our country, and we still don't have a super ecosystem that is actually really capable of providing these fast responses. And when the pandemic grew and reached its peak, well, the demand grew so much that we really did not have enough supply to respond properly.
And so what has happened a great deal is that the ecosystem has grown a little bit. And as John has said, at the government level, you have scientific committees. Scientific community. And so there are some committees that are full of experts. There are committees that have stricter methodologies and standards when it comes to the evidence they provide. But if we look at the local government level, if we look at the university, and we look at civil society, in the case of Brazil, we have very unique circumstances because we have a lot of NGOs currently that promote and also work on ensuring that the government receives available evidence. So the ecosystem has grown and the response capacity has grown a little bit, but not as much as demand has grown. But what we have seen we've seen that there are very distinct methods in different states. So it's not that the best available evidence is reaching governments, because the methods used are totally different. And so the concern that we have with quality, etc., are not standardized for all of the evidence centers or actors in the ecosystem. We've also found another difficult issue in Brazil, and that is rework or duplication of efforts. So we are trying to avoid that different centers in such a large country do the same syntheses or the same research. So we started to work with some public tools to come up with a question bank for public policy and start to identify syntheses that other countries were already creating, and therefore it wasn't necessary for us to do that rework. We also did a lot of translations from English to Portuguese, from Spanish to Portuguese, of questions that many countries were already responding to. And we were able to identify the best available evidence and the best available syntheses, as John mentioned, and translate these to respond and give this information to decision makers. So little by little, in small steps. And so we are trying to improve still in the whole research field, not only for the pandemic, but the pandemic is a clearer case of doubling of efforts or rework, because we see issues with HR, with other resources. For us, it's extremely important to raise awareness about what's already being done in other countries and what we could simply contextualize for our region. When it comes to the Brazilian ecosystem, we also have trust-building exercises and training. In Brazil, when we create other workflows or other communication flows for evidence, governments in Brazil still want to connect directly with a trusted researcher and know what these experts think. So what we did, and so the point is to make contact with these people close to decision makers so that they can truly understand the value of using the best available evidence and not just any evidence that's around there. We saw a lot of lobbying and a lot of advocacy for different types of evidence to be used, because obviously there's a lot of money flying around now more than ever before. So there's also an opportunity here for people to present their own evidence as the best, even when that is not the case. What we did for better coordination of our efforts was to create last year a Brazilian Coalition for Evidence. This is inspired by an African evidence network. The idea is to look at the evidence centers and look at those who work with research centers with the best evidence to work together. So this is a coalition in which we get together every 2 months. We talk about what's being done. And what we try to do is also eliminate doubling of efforts. And here we have methodological alignment and ethical alignment in terms of how evidence should be used. One question that was very important for us to look at life before and after a pandemic, we saw that many efforts were focused on, of course, responding to questions related to the pandemic, but there are also a lot of other policies and issues occurring in Brazil that demanded rapid responses and the use of evidence, especially at the social level. So we had terrible situations here in our prisons. We've also had very difficult situations in education, not only due to the pandemic, but also due to other issues. But here, efforts were truly focused only on the pandemic, and we are forgetting other issues that needed to be looked at. And so we decided to look at what was happening with other policies that had been left behind during the pandemic. So for us, it was also extremely important to continue to speak with others working with policies that were no longer a priority, but that are important in our context and in the Brazilian case in particular. We also made a greater effort in participating with different networks. So the health network, Evento Brazil. We also have peers. We've also participated in Evidence Synthesis International, ESCI, and also 3IE. Because being connected with what was happening around the world and translating the material that was important to Brazil, but also maintaining our focus on our own specific challenges and issues here in Brazil. And that was an issue, obviously, when everybody's attention was on evidence related to the pandemic. These exchanges and also talks that we have had with other members in the network has led to more exchange with Chile and Colombia. And it's been a really valuable experience. And this enabled us to understand how some of these challenges are shared in the Latin America region. So we created a Latin American and Caribbean Evidence Hub. So we founded this at the end of last year. We have been working since December to have a dedicated team to map out key stakeholders, to conduct situation analyses, and as John shared earlier, understand our shared evidence system, also prioritize shared policy questions and produce rapid reviews or responses to understand where these quick responses can be found for timely responses. And when it comes to future steps and challenges during the pandemic in Brazil, we received a lot of questions about how to design and implement social implementations and initiatives. And so we don't yet have a quick response for that particular issue, but what we believe is that this is the next step to be focused on. For a long time, we were focused on prioritizing problems and defining them. And decision makers also invite us to think in coming steps in the next political cycle. So that's Brazil's situation from my perspective, and now I'll hand over to my colleagues. Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you for your presentation and for sharing this experience with us. It's very interesting to hear what you've been through in Veredas and about the Brazilian context. Brazil, when it comes to evidence use in decision-making, is a model for us to follow. It's interesting to see how you've connected with different stakeholders. That's very interesting. I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions for you at the end. Please remember once again to use the Q&A module. I will ask these questions to our panelists at the end of the presentations so that they have the opportunity to respond to some of these questions that you are asking. So I would invite you to please continue to share your questions in the chat. Now, I will hand over to Lucy Kuhn so that she can share with us her experience in the use of evidence to inform decisions, talking about her experience in the Ministry of Health in Chile. So Lucy, if you can hear me, please go ahead. Yes, I can hear you. Thank you so much. Please let me know if you're hearing me clearly. Okay, great. Yes, we hear you perfectly. Thank you. Let me then share my screen. Just give me a moment.
A ver, ustedes me avisan.
Okay, please tell me. Yes, we can see your screen. Yes. Please go to the next slide to make sure it's working. Okay, now? Okay, you seeing the full screen? Yes, we are. Perfect. Yes, excellent. Okay, great. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's fantastic to always be learning from colleagues in the region. I'm going to focus a little on a perspective which is perhaps related to the use of evidence and everything that this has meant, especially over the last 2.5 years of the pandemic. I work in the Ministry of Health in Chile. So of course, for us, it was quite a significant shift. The arrival of this pandemic and well, this meant obviously that this became 100% prioritization for the pandemic and leaving everything we'd been doing up to the pandemic behind. In 2019 in Chile, in October, we had some social protests, great discontent amongst our people. And we saw also cases of repression and violence. So the context was really shaken up. Perhaps as we see in all countries and most governments, at least in this region, the use of evidence depends quite a lot on who is in charge. How much they really trust or intend to use evidence, and how much this really influences their decision-making, because the decision-making culture in Chile is very centralized. And so this means that decisions are made behind closed doors by very small groups who stay in power for a very long time. And so evidence doesn't really have such a relevant position when it comes to decision making. And I think we've advanced quite a bit, but this is a challenge. So here on this first slide, you can see here my department. So we are the Sanitary Technologies Assessment Area, and this is part of the ministerial apparatus. And up until last year, at least, we responded directly when it came to the pandemic to requests that came from the ministry, that is to say, internal requests and other internal groups. But we've also, I don't know if we've had a close relationship or it's been a lot of contact, but we have also had relationships with the scientific community, the national and international scientific communities and other ministries, with universities, etc. But always kind of coming at things from different directions, because I think the scientific community would have wanted the ministry to make data and information more available for evidence to be produced. But there are a series of working groups put together here. But in our team, in this department, which is about creating evidence for decision-making in different areas, we had a connection with, we didn't have direct connection or communication, sorry, with the COVID consultation board with other commissions. And here, there's also another relevant shift to take into account. We also had a change in government and with another ideology and with another approach to the use of evidence. So now what we see is the configuration of the COVID-19 Consultation Council that was made up of experts from around the world, from the scientific and academic spheres, as well as from the ministry. And that was quite willful, so to speak, when it came to creating the national response. Now they are requesting much more active participation from us with this change of government. So it's not only a reactive relationship now, but it's actually come and be a part of this working group and make proposals. So that's why I wanted to start with this organizational diagram and with this context so you can understand the structure of the ministry. And this is an excellent opportunity so this is a limitation because we have these technical issues. We are not necessarily directly connected with decision making.
Entonces, acá un poco de lo que
So I'd like to show a bit about what I find most relevant to comment, and I think this is one of the most interesting characteristics of these evidence policies in Chile, and it's how we are able to institutionalize this within the Ministry of Health. However, there is much more to do. When we talk about institutionality, perhaps we're just institutionalizing the production, as I mentioned before, but the use is not institutionalized. This is a pending topic. And here I'd like to just tell you how this evolution has happened. This is a very new program. It has the development of this discipline actually started in the universities together with regional initiatives. And recently, some 7 years ago, this office or branch is established side by side with the governmental administration that took power in 2014. And since then, there's been quite a lot of development. Not only have we been developing those evidence-based or informed policies, but we also created this department that I just pointed out that has, for example, a specific unit for evidence, specifically for policies in terms of coverage and with a certain set of benefits for this unit that was created. So this timeline basically shows how we've been able to progress and grow. And until last year, I think we were a team of 4, and before just a team of 1 person. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, well, we've been able to have a budget opportunity for greater scales. And this is something pretty complex in the public administration, at least in the case of Chile, due to a restricted budget, and also because we don't really perceive, or these teams are not perceived as something essential. Therefore, we are the last in the queue, so to speak. And it's quite an expensive process. So within the framework of this pandemic, we've created these transitory positions to be able to respond to the need. We are still living this, as I mentioned, when we've created this commission. And so the question that is posed is how much stability can we guarantee for the future as these positions are transitory? Well, when the sanitary emergency, for example, is no longer considered in Chile, well, these transitory positions will most probably not exist anymore. Therefore, there's quite instability in terms of the confirmation of these teams. So I would say that in this small area, and I speak comparatively with the work that is being done in the ministries and so on, I believe that the work of this specific unit within this Department of Sanitary Technologies Evaluations and evidence-based health, I think one of the greatest challenges was to reorganize and adapt very, very quickly to the requirements of the pandemic, and not only what this implied, meaning organizing the teams and these specifically more hybrid or remote work formats. Sometimes, for example, there were long pauses. At the beginning, we really didn't know what we needed to ask. So that basically obliged us to become much more proactive, start creating new products. So for example, so with this slide is relevant because, as I mentioned, in this department, this department is composed by 3 units. So the unit that is in charge of all clinical evidence, basically dedicated to 100% to develop practical clinical guidelines for clinical and hospital management for COVID-19 patients, and in a dynamic where we needed to update constantly. I think that this was also a very relevant change. With the pandemic, publications were so quickly updated that everything was quite outdated very quickly. And the fact that we needed to update evidence constantly was an important and significant change for us as well, in terms of how we organized ourselves, how we organized our work, and trying not to lose the quality of our work and the rigor with which we carried it out. So we also had to adapt a lot of methods to be able to reach these or answer these questions in just hours of time. And within our unit, well, we have these evidence products that are much more based in health policies and the methodological development, creation of or capacity building. Our main objectives or strategic objectives is to be able to synthesize the best scientific evidence and to make it available to decision makers. And of course, due to this, the production of evidence was quite important with small teams. So I think that the sense of belonging to the health sector, I would like to mention that the physicians that were there on the first line were, well, the effort and the contribution they made was so big that no one wanted to be left behind. So these were weeks of working Monday through Sunday, 20 hours per day, to be able to really kind of know what to do, basically. And before the pandemic, we wanted to say, or we decided, okay, a map of evidence would be good to do. And so there was a lot of discussion on what to prioritize and whatnot. So the first months, we were very, very proactive in this process, in these evidence products. We carried out exploratory synthesis of evidence. And then during the months of March to May, well, this map was a new product because many of the cases that were happening at international level, for example, was in English. And this is a language barrier for decision makers in Spanish-speaking countries, for example, or in all non-English speaking countries. So we advanced in this updating of this living evidence map and the evolution of these products. Well, we had to stop doing them in a way to really start to respond more to more specific questions. So this exercise was very interesting, this exercise of creating this living evidence map, because it allowed us to really visualize not only authorities, but other technical teams. What is it, or what was it that was happening and what was being published? And as of that, many other questions arise for them to be answered in a much broader way, with also a more comprehensive review of evidence. And in regards to collaboration, I believe that this was key during this time. We collaborated a lot with top universities because usually the ministry is very much linked with the universities through contracts, meaning we buy studies from academia or from research centers. And here we created quite a synthesis or a synergy, as we all had the same objectives, and to create joint projects without really establishing any contract or any formal agreement. And I would say that I think that's all what I wanted to share. I don't know if I extended my time, but any questions you have? Any questions you have, I am here to respond. Thank you. Hello, Lucy. Thank you. Thank you. You did not extend your time. Don't worry. Do not worry about the time. It was okay. So thank you very much for respecting it. And thank you very much for sharing your experience from the Ministry of Health of Chile. For sure, we will have many questions and we will be writing them down in the question box or in the Q&A module. You as panelists can see some of the questions that participants have made to the event. At the end of the event, I will read them so that we can answer them as they come. So now I'd like to give the floor to Verónica Osorio. Verónica will share about her experience working on evidence-based policies from different standpoints. She has had the opportunity to support some governments in this topic specifically, and currently as a student of this UCL in the UK, where she's working with several groups. Amongst these, several of the people who are working here and supporting what other groups and units are doing in these evidence-based policies. So Verónica, please take the floor. Thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you to your team for your invitation. It's an honor to share this panel with people that I admire so much as you. And to share, I want to share my screen. Please let me know if you can see it now. All right. All right, so I will specifically talk about my experience and the experience I've had in the pandemic, which has been mainly focused on the first year of the pandemic, on the quick response, where at the time where we still did not really have any knowledge about the treatments, about how the virus behaved, and how decision makers, both the decision makers as the population, were in a, let's say, panic situation, without really having clear responses and without really having knowledge about what was happening and all the different crises that were going to occur in the future, because this was not only a sanitary crisis. So I will specifically focus in a moment that has been, I think, a key to be able to analyze everything that I want to convey. And this moment was exactly when the governments had to leave mandatory lockdowns. As we all know, most of our governments have taken the decision to continue what the WHO was recommending, which at that given time was mandatory lockdowns within countries, closing of frontiers, social distancing, and the use of face masks. And so mandatory lockdowns were absolutely unsustainable. And as our previous speakers, Laura and Lucy has mentioned, in the Latin American region, there was also a social crisis. Each country was living their own social and political crises. And so this pandemic occurred in a very, very specific and special moment, in a social, political, and economic crisis moment. And so we were living these mandatory lockdowns, and decision makers had to really know how to do this, because not only, and this was something very specific per country, but not only per country, but also inside the countries and in the regions, and in the regions, in the cities, and in the cities by area as well, because these were very specific cases in relation to the behavior of people and society as well. And I think it's worth mentioning and highlighting that in the greatest portion of our region, informal economy represents over 60%. Therefore, people needed to work in the streets and relate to really ensure their daily livelihoods. So this graph right here shows, this is one of the numerous graphs that we presented to the cabinet of ministry that we were supporting in Bolivia, my country. So what has happened as a result of this sanitary crisis from my point of view? I would say that mainly there has been a greater predisposition towards the use of evidence from decision makers, not only at a governmental level, but also in the private sector and in all areas that we can imagine. And this has given floor to the fact that we can create greater communication between those that produce and those that use evidence, which has also led to a greater collaboration between the scientific community and the population, but also a better interpretation of these. And I think that Lucy has mentioned this. We in Latin America, well, with the pandemic, has really caught us in a very much lag behind situation. So we really had to see and take reference of other countries and how the virus was behaving and what was being done in terms of treatment and policies, so that we could also decide within our region what to do. However, this translation and this specific context was, I think, the most important point. And although there was funding, the specific needs for this to be fast was important. Aside from this, the population was also having abundant access to all types of information, including, for example, false news or false information that has also limited or has created a social pressure as well on decision makers in terms of key decisions that we needed to take during the crisis. I'd just like to mention some of the consequences that have arisen. And I also want to highlight that not only we had this sanitary crisis at that given moment, not only were we seeing the health-related evidence, but also what could we do, for example, in terms of education, with schools closed, with the access to internet and communication, migration, meaning there were really variable topics and so important ones as well, that it was also necessary to prioritize these decision making when everything was important, basically. So I would like to now share how this decision-making process has happened to really now open or stop or pause the mandatory lockdowns in Bolivia, specifically where I've been able to have a more active role between researchers as a researcher myself and with decision makers, which in that given time was a transitory government that had to stay for 3 months, and because of the pandemic, they extended to a government of 9 months. So firstly, as a first step, even before the first case of COVID-19 was identified in Bolivia, there has been an abundant increase of research on behalf of Bolivian researchers, because there's been a greatest interest in helping to decide, whomever actually. So for example, we had economists creating economic models to be able to predict the peak of the pandemic. There were also technology industry parties trying to create models in the cloud to be able to monitor cases, because this was not really advanced in Bolivia. There were also company people that wanted to boost production, for example, of meat, because there weren't supermarkets and restaurants were closed. So actually, there was a whole individual interest from each sector to research and to really create evidence understood as the different concepts that evidence may have.
And here we have the need to have conscious decisions. Obviously, these decisions were going to be important for the country. Clearly, lifting the strict quarantine was going to be significant. Decision makers, and here I refer more to ministers and also the president, in turn, start to look for experts to support the response, not only from the scientific committees that exist in ministries, as well as in the Pan American Health Organization, but it's also about looking for trustworthy sources. They wanted to have people who they trusted. And then seeing that this was working better, because they started to receive information that served them for decision making, they start to put together councils that have not been very successful, because these were councils of experts to specific questions that they had. For example, the use of hydrochloroquine. So very specific questions, also advice as to how to take or make decisions in specific contexts. When was it expected that the pandemic would peak? We constantly talk about the peak in Bolivia in order to see how this would fit in with the presidential elections. That had quite a high political cost. In my role, I was part of these councils or boards of experts, and then we were placed as intermediaries between evidence creators and politicians. This enabled us to carry out quick systematic revisions so that we could give very rapid information and to politicians and ensure them of the quality so that they could make decisions at key moments. Of course, we have Model 1 and Model 2, the push model and the pull model, and then we had different models working in parallel in different areas. But when it came to decision making, of course, the social pressure that existed had more weight than what we would have liked to propose and what was suggested in accordance with what the evidence was showing at the global and local level. But while this was seen in Bolivia, when I was in this role, I realized that this didn't or wasn't only happening in Bolivia, but was actually happening in many different countries to varying degrees. As part of this network, Emerging Voices for Global Health, I've been part of this organization since 2018. I've been able to have access or first-hand access to information to what's been happening in other countries, because this brought together young health professionals who are working all around the world. So if I found out, for example, what was happening in Costa Rica or in India, when there was certain situations occurring, for example, the explosion of deaths in India or the creation of local rapid tests in Costa Rica, I could bring that information directly to this network. Last week, in fact, I asked a question about how this network has helped us during the pandemic. And one of the things that this has most helped us with, those of us who have been working in the pandemic, is to give us greater trust and confidence in what we're sharing. It's not only about looking successful in failed cases, but rather a safe space and motivation to continue working, because this was a really difficult situation. Obviously, now as part of my doctoral studies and looking at everything in context and knowing more about what's happened in Brazil, Chile, and Colombia, thanks to peers and LATAM Hub, I believe that one of the greatest successes in the region of what we've seen is the need to create a regional network that can truly give us this level of certainty when it comes to creating evidence and better regional coordination, and also greater coordination nationally, whether this is a local or departmental or national level. And this can help with decision making. And additionally, this is a model to follow when it comes to creating trust on the part of legislators and decision makers, because we see appropriate use of tools for quick and effective decision making. So that's a little bit about my experience in broad strokes, what I have been through in the pandemic and the use of evidence here in the region. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Veronica. Thank you for your presentation. And thank you for sharing your experience. It's been interesting to hear about the support that you've received in Bolivia and the work you've done with Emerging Voices. We have just a few minutes now, or some minutes left now, for the questions that have been asked in the chat, in the Q&A module. We have several questions here. I'm going to prioritize the questions asked by the attendees, though I have many I'd like to ask myself. So the first question, I would like to ask this question to John. So I'd like to bring this question together with another one. So John, what is to come with the Evidence Commission report? What are the future steps for the report? Where is the report headed? And let me bring this together with the first question here in the Q&A module, which says, what correlation exists between the adoption, implementation, development, and assessment of e-health as a state policy and the different levels and qualities of health evidence that are reported from Latin American countries. In Latin America, just to give you a bit of context, John, or maybe more specifically in Colombia, we have public policy for the implementation of e-health or digital health in order to reach different regions in the country, and we have different programs and proposals to get this done. So the question is, what correlation does this have with the different levels and qualities of evidence? So please go ahead, John.
Thanks very much. So the next steps for the Evidence Commission, specifically the Secretariat, is to pursue those three priorities that I mentioned. So they, through extensive consultations, strike us and the commissioners as the areas where it is most important that we have an impact. So the Secretariat is very small. We can only do things in partnership with others. So for the first one, the domestic evidence infrastructure strengthening, as I mentioned, we're working with people in 20 jurisdictions to do those rapid assessments and to support the learning and improvement. We're learning a lot from them. Hopefully, we're helping them out in a small way. For the global evidence architecture, we have a series of engagements focused on those different groups I mentioned, different parts of the UN system, funders. We have a meeting tomorrow with a funders network to encourage them to be investing in the types of domestic evidence support systems that you heard Laura, Lucy, and Veronica speak about. And then putting evidence at the center of everyday life is, as I mentioned, a multi-year undertaking. So there we're taking very small steps, working with citizen leaders and a small group of citizens serving non-governmental organizations to take those first small steps in that area. So that's the current plan. And we anticipate that, like Coveted, the Evidence Commission Secretariat will probably come to an end at the end of 2022, and we'll get back to some of our normal work, but we do hope to, a few years out, check in to see where action has been taken and provide a bit of a report card on whether and how the recommendations were acted on. In terms of the question about e-health, I'll be honest that I'm not aware of any empirical studies, and I don't see a direct correlation based on my personal experiences between the advanced in digital health or e-health and the use of evidence. At the level of evidence implementation, digital health, of course, can be a very powerful enabler. So if you can build in high quality evidence into electronic health records, a variety of other digital solutions, right at the point of care, that increases the chance that people will start to practice in ways that are in line with the best evidence. But simply having the digital solutions isn't enough. You need to do a lot of other things to support the necessary behavior changes among professionals and patients. When we get up to the level of government policymakers and organizational leaders, that's where it's not as obvious to me that there is a direct connection. So again, there are digital innovations that can help us do this. So artificial intelligence can do some of the work for us in maintaining living evidence syntheses. Digital libraries, searchable databases like the Coveted inventory are examples of digital solutions that can put evidence syntheses at policymakers' fingertips. So they're perhaps best thought of as enablers of use, but I don't necessarily see that the more digitally advanced governments are necessarily more advanced with respect to evidence use. So again, I'm not aware of empirical studies. This is only personal observation, and it could be our partners in Latin American countries see a much more direct connection than I do. So those are my quick reactions, Daniel.
Gracias, John, por
John, thank you. Thank you very much for your answer. The next question, this is for John and Laura, but I also think that Lucy might have something to say here. So let me read the question out. One of the general conversations that tends to take place when we talk about this topic is related to the fact that evidence is not built in a vacuum. Despite everything else, there are obviously powerful interests when it comes to the construction and interpretation of evidence. Nonetheless, those who work in the area as technicians or experts believe that evidence itself is neutral. So this creates a tension between technicians and politicians and professionals, etc. So what do you think of this situation? I will first hand over to Laura so she can give us her perspective and opinion. And then I will come back to John. And Lucy, if you have something that you would like to add there, please go ahead. Laura. Okay, let me answer as much as I can very quickly. Right now, we are looking at e-health. So I've just shared my email address in the chat because I can share that research information. But I do agree with John that in Brazil, we have a lot of telehealth initiatives, but it's very similar to the situation that we have with our panels of experts. And it's not always related to better use of evidence. And in 2 months, we should have that study ready, and I'd be happy to share it with you. Okay. Okay, so when it comes to evidence not being created in a vacuum and interests, I think that there's a very serious debate here. Those of us who are involved, we understand that there is a bias here when it comes to the use of evidence. The best thing that we can do is communicate in the most transparent way possible the existing biases and uncertainties. We have the Global Commission and Cochrane that talk a lot about how during the pandemic, there was, of course, a great deal of uncertainty, and the final decisions were always political. They were always going to be political. So I think it's about being very transparent when it comes to communicating biases and uncertainty. And it's also about working with other types of evidence related to equity and implementation. It's about understanding distinctions between countries for better information, so there's also greater trust, and have as much trust as possible when it comes to each type of evidence. For me, this was more of an issue of tension in the past, but now I just think it's about having really explicit communication. We need to talk about what happens when we work with scientific evidence and where there's uncertainty, and not try to sell it as anything different. Juan, I see, also talked about how despite greatest efforts in Latin America, perhaps the results were not the greatest in the pandemic, and that's true. In Brazil, we have two very strong discourses. We have one discourse which is very pro-evidence, and then there's another counter-scientific discourse. And so we would have benefited from having, I think, one central guideline from the federal level, because all of the same laws should have in theory been followed, but that didn't happen. And in our experience, when it comes to health, we had some good results. We also had certain social results, for example, cash transfers and other very important policies. Because when the pandemic arrived to Brazil, obviously there was a great deal of poverty, a very socially and politically fragile moment for our country. So, I mean, evidence is just one part of that, but there are many other factors at play here. In other locations, we had fantastic results with collaborative work between universities and working with civil society organizations and also governments, so that decisions could be made that were very specific and led to changes in results and made them much better than they might have otherwise been. When it comes to the Commission report, I think that it has fantastic methodological indications, councils, and we have also great use of evidence that we can share with you. And now that I'm talking about civil society, I can also talk about how to collaborate with or have better work between the academy, the ministry, and governments. For us, what is key is triangulation. A lot of the time, the money that is going to fund a collaboration will not come from academy or governments, but actually from civil society or a UN agency, and that makes also these collaborations more transparent. But it's also about having shared agendas and having the same mission. When it comes to governments, academy, and civil society, you have to work on shared prioritization, and that's really helped us to resolve this issue of how to make collaboration possible when it comes to the financial aspect. I'm sorry for going on so much, but I responded as much as I could.
Le doy la palabra a John para después terminar con Lucy y
Thank you,
con
Laura. I'll give the floor to John for us to then finish with Veronica and the rest.
I guess I don't experience the tension in the way it was described. Maybe it's just because I see my role as being very circumscribed. So I see democratically elected leaders who have to make tough decisions. And then I see, as Lucy gave the example of, social movements who at times can hold them to account. And I see my role as trying to inject evidence into those political conversations. And so my role feels quite circumscribed. Do I have values? Absolutely. One of them is that in my role, I should be as systematic and transparent as I can in identifying, assessing, and presenting the evidence exactly as Laura said. And I also am typically quite explicit about the fact that I think an equity lens is absolutely critical in looking at the evidence and creating an evidence product. And that when we organize processes like stakeholder dialogues and citizen panels to put the evidence alongside all the political factors, that it's helpful to take an equity lens and to make sure voices are heard from different parts of society who may not normally get a seat at the table. But I don't think that you can predict what I will say on any given issue, because I try to, in a systematic and transparent way, just say, this is what the evidence shows. So it's a bit different from somebody working in a think tank aligned to a political party, or someone working in a think tank paid for by a wealthy industrialist who is pursuing a particular agenda. In our case, the values that we hold dear are being systematic and transparent, and bringing an equity lens to looking at the evidence, and to bringing together voices who can shed light on all the other political factors. So again, it might be politically naive, but it served us very well. Politicians have to make tough choices. It feels like my job, at least, is to try to inject evidence into that conversation. Back to you, Daniel.
Gracias, John. Bueno, ahora le doy la palabra a Lucy y a Verónica.
Thank you, John. Now I'd like to give the floor to Lucy and Veronica. Perhaps you would like to talk a bit about this question. Perhaps the intersection of the evidence with values, interests, and how these policies are designed or formulated. And this topic that you both talked about, which is the relationship between the ministries of health in the case of Lucy, or in the case of the of Veronica and what she mentioned on how to support this decision-making process and how we can strengthen this relationship between the different ministries, the universities. You mentioned something about the contracts and how to institutionalize this relationship between the university and the decision makers and the producers of these evidence. Thank you very much, Daniel. Yes, so I believe that regarding this question, at a ministerial level, I do perceive this. However, I perceive it in two different spheres. One would be, well, obviously depending on the topic that we're talking about. Some are more accessible than others. For example, currently we're under a tax reform, so obviously all the evidence that we're looking at will probably have taxes on alcohol, tobacco, all these different efforts. This evidence has been, for example, funded by the pharmaceutical and food industries and alcohol industries. Can you hear me well? I think my connection. All right, so back. Our vision has always been, as you well said, being very transparent and identifying the biases, the risks of bias, certainty of evidence. In some cases, we've realized that, for example, in these type of discussions that are very relevant, it is very relevant to identify who is funding that investigation. This is something that we usually do not incorporate. However, this makes quite a lot of sense. So that's one side of it. And another thing that has happened, specifically, I've been working for almost 10 years in ministry. And it's that from all sides, whomever wants to perhaps orient or aim the type of evidence that is being used in favor or against in a decision that has already been made. Or, for example, to request evidence to reinforce decisions that already have been made. And that is quite difficult. There is a tension. I believe that we as a team, well, we have quite a methodological rigor, but I would say that this is something from the people that work there, meaning today's team, for example, is composed by people that have quite high ethical values, but perhaps we leave, and perhaps that next team is composed of people that not necessarily may be so concerned about these standards. Perhaps then there wouldn't be any problem for this evidence to be used in a very arbitrary way. Therefore, there isn't quite a way of filtering. It really depends on the will of all of those working on this. So I believe that there are tensions in these situations. I myself have had to debate, for example, I've been asked, okay, evidence shows that this is not concluding, but for example, I have all studies that back up this, and these are quite selected studies, for example, and I've had to debate this. Fortunately, no one has fired me yet, but I do think that this is quite a willfully dependent topic. And just to finish about the relationships with the universities, I think I've always found it for example, the governmental restrictions in Chile, to be able to dialogue with the academia or private parties, because we must really safeguard the privacy of public resources and so on. So there should always be this contracting and tendering processes. However, these are made as to buy real estate or purchase a computer. These are not really designed and thought for the nature of what actually carrying out a study is about. And before the pandemic, I had the opportunity to carry out these collaborations with, for example, the Boston University. And the OPS was as an intermediary, meaning there weren't any funds from the ministry or from the University of Boston. We were both interested in publishing. This is an incentive. And the OPS didn't pay any any royalties fees, meaning they funded, for example, travel expenses, and they also funded, for example, the fee of the journal in which we published. But this was something that quite surprised me. This was in the year 2016, 2017. This was an experience with the PAHO in the case of Chile, but for the case of Chile, I wouldn't know any other mechanism than perhaps a third agent that can really create the incentives and that can really respond to this, because beyond working for free or not, I think we want to work for it or do this due to motivation, due to the sake of having good evidence and publishing it. So I think that this figure can really be beneficial. I do think that researchers and investigators, I'm not referring to the administrative entities or personnel of the university, they have a salary. They don't really care about these topics as the people from the ministry, but of course, for researchers, this is a different topic. Yeah, that would be my answer.
Gracias por tus
Thank you,
aportes.
Lucy. Thank you for your contributions. Now I'd like to give the last minutes to Veronica for her to participate about this
De esas alianzas
question
entre la
on
academia
what do you think is the future between these partnerships, between the university, the researchers, and decision makers. And I saw that you answered a question specifically asked to you about how fast this evidence reaches in a crisis such as the pandemic. So please take the floor, Veronica. Thank you very much. Well, these different partnerships between the academia and the different health ministries are very well based on the policies. And as long as our political values as countries are also quite not well directed, well, we won't be able to have a direct and transparent connection or partnership either. Because I've had, well, in my experience, for example, there was an evidence that was not certainly appealable to the people that were holding positions in the government, so they modified it, and another person presented it. I had a researcher is quite replaceable as any other professional, and certainly there will be another person that complies with the government's interests. So I really believe that this is something that is a long-term work. There are also studies that state that think tanks, for example, that are supposedly institutions that are dedicated to create investigation and evidence for decision making. Well, at least in Latin America, they try to quite control this because this is something of political interest. And if you say something that perhaps that government official does not like, or perhaps a strong criticism, then policies will be quite perhaps distorted towards that. So they also try to avoid that contact. So both on the side of the academia as well as the policy designers, I think they need to change political values. And so I think that this is something that should be worked on from the education standpoint and also as a long-term aim. And I also would like to just mention the last point that you asked me. How fast can fast evidence be in a crisis? Well, it's actually slow, I would say, because when an emergency arises, be it a sanitary, climate-related emergency, any type of emergency, we need data now, basically. And that is exactly the main barrier as a researcher that we have, because we don't really have good databases for these evidence to be of high quality and that we can really have solid results. This certainly takes time. And to those that make decisions is not something that is attractive or appealable. So we try to do the best we can. All right, Veronica, thank you very much for your answer. I think we've reached the end of this webinar. We've now extended a few minutes. Here in Colombia, it's now 2 past the hour, and it's actually lunchtime. So thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you, John. Thank you, Laura, Lucy, and Veronica, for having accepted our invitation. You are people with whom we've worked and we've been working on since years, and hopefully we continue sharing these efforts and learnings in this network. Remember that the recording of this webinar will be available in the social media networks in YouTube, Facebook of our University of Antioquia, as well as the University Javeriana. And we've also recorded it in English, John, so that once we have this recording in English, we can share it in English in our channel and in other countries. So thank you very much for your participation, and thank you to all attendees as well. Greetings to all of you.